Good morning, beautiful people of the internet, and welcome once more to our Sunday special. Joined as always by the lovely Helen Chorley, the enigmatic Piotr Rusnek, the absolute powerhouse that is Adam Lawrence, and myself, Jay Howard. Just Jay Howard. There we go. So today we are going to be talking about the voice of the people. If you look at it from one person's perspective, or you could be talking about it in terms of anti-governmental zealots that are trying to close down the country. What we're talking about today, ladies and gentlemen, is strikes and strike action. And we're going to let Mr. Lawrence kick off with the numbers and the figures. And we're just going to tear the world to pieces trying to figure out right from wrong.
Well, Jay, and I think we should call you the humble Jay Howard, apart from anything else, to be clear. I like data because numbers don't lie. Numbers can be used by liars to manipulate things, and they can be used to make political points. They can be used to confuse people. They can be used for all those purposes, but it's not the numbers' fault. It's the people using them that are usually at fault. So I was interested to see the OECD had published some figures about teachers specifically. And I don't want to pick on teachers, but I'm going to have to because those are the figures that I've seen, I'm afraid. And teachers in the UK work fewer hours than anyone else in the OECD apart from Luxembourg. So if you want to be a cushy teacher, go to Luxembourg. But to put that into effect, in a year, the average UK teacher is working about 1,250 hours, right? As measured by the OECD. If you compared that to Italy, for example, it's about 1,550 hours. So there's around about a 25% difference there. And if you compared it to, let's say you were a very ambitious associate or similar position in a legal practice or a consulting firm or an accountancy practice or something like that, your performance would be being measured by how many hours you billed every year. And you would be looking to be billing 1,800 plus hours, maybe 2,000 if you were in one of the big four or the big six, depending on the industry. And to be clear, you'd be working more hours than that because you wouldn't be billing for every single thing that you did. There's always a write-off, and it's part of that negotiation when somebody moans about their bill and you say, well, hold on a second, we've actually written off, 20% of the hours spent here. So that puts that, I think, into some context. I think there's been a lot of pushback over the years with teachers saying, hold on. And it's a bit of a classic situation where the benchmark 20 or 30 years ago was 13 weeks holiday with very little time and effort put in. And, 1,250, if we multiplied 37.5 by 52, I'm going to struggle with the maths here, but that's about 2,000, near enough. I won't be too far off with that, I don't think. A little bit under 2,000. Then we took off 5.6 weeks of holiday, which is the legal statutory minimum. Then that's what you would be working, in theory, in a minimum wage job or similar if you were on full-time equivalent. So you would actually be working around about, what would that be? Around about 1,800 hours, if my maths isn't too far off, that you'd actually be getting paid for. Then you'd have to get to and from work and all the rest of it. So 1,250 over 1,800 is around about 2/3, realistically. So I think that needs to be put into context. And most teachers might argue, well, I'd actually rather work more hours and get more money. And the job doesn't kind of provision for that. So that is a difficulty that you face. I've often thought, I'm a terrible teacher, so I couldn't be a teacher. But I did think, it might not be a bad industry for aspiring property investors because they do have a reasonable amount of extra time at certain points. If only deals came along in nice, orderly fashions at the start of the summer holidays and the start of the Easter holidays or whatever, it might be a viable thing to do. But that's where the numbers are, and I lost a bit of respect, I must say, for the teachers again, it's unfair to blame the teachers directly, but I would blame the unions. I think it's easy to forget in these situations that the unions are just run by politicians who are on salaries that are greater than the average MP's salary, the MP mandated salary, and they're brilliant spin doctors of these things, and they pick people who have got very normal accents from working class areas And these people are largely wolves in sheep's clothing, in my opinion. They're depending on 125, 150 grand salary, some of them even more than that. And look, they've got a job to do, and their job is to get their members as much money as humanly possible. And that's what the job is, right? We can put a lot of fluff around that, but that's what the job is. And really, the unspoken bit there is, and sod the consequences for the wider economy, right? And this is the big problem I've got at the moment as an economist, in terms of, ultimately, if we just keep putting wages up, then prices will keep going up and inflation will just mushroom. And that's one thing that the government are fundamentally correct on. Now, perhaps just to lay the other side of the argument as I see it and then pass over to you guys, ultimately, on the back of 10 plus years of austerity, which hasn't done what one would have hoped it would do, which hasn't been helpful, which wasn't the right policy at the right time. It was a very Liz Truss style policy, to be honest. I still blame George Osborne primarily, but maybe that's just because I really don't like the man very much. And I still don't want to hear him giggling on the radio about how he learned economics while he was the Chancellor. Well, A, no, you didn't, mate. Still rubbish at economics. And B, that ain't funny in my book. You know, why don't we get someone who actually understood that stuff in post? You know, it's a disgrace, and that's part of the problem with the political system as a whole. But ultimately, you know, they are on the back of a 10 plus year stint of being treated very poorly from a wage perspective. And if we don't like it, you know, it's the government's job to reform it. Finland we spend about I think there might be like 6.25% of our GDP on education. Finland spend about 7.5% of their GDP on education, right? Finnish teachers have a master's degree. They earn about 50 grand a year on average. They don't actually start teaching formally as we would see it until the age of 7. It's very sort of Montessori before then. And they have an incredible record with their education system. Whereas we survive these days. I do get concerned about this, but we survive on our centuries-old reputation and our magnificent old institutions like Oxford University. Obviously, other ones are available, but they're not as good. You know, and one day that the scam is going to break, because you see a lot of people, certainly in America these days, who are quite influential, talking about how college is a scam. You know, and I'm not talking sort of far-right Republicans necessarily. People like Bill Maher, who's a very open-speaking Democrat, talking very often about the scam that is higher education, because the fees just go. Obviously, the fees over there have ballooned, and the professors earn $500,000 a year. And you know, great institutions like Oxford have actually kept a lid on that. Although other competing red brick universities are nudging up the price for academics and all the rest of it. But we need to deliver. And on the flip side of that, we've also got a government who wants to reduce immigration numbers at all costs, which means cutting student immigration by offering less attractive terms, which is such a perverse use of the numbers. It's so bloody annoying. But back to whether you guys think I've been completely unfair, and I know I've picked on the teachers, but that's the data that I had, or whether you're on side and I need to be flogged at dawn, or what do you reckon?
It's not the best sounding board to take a position on, but every once in a while I'll dial into LBC. I've got one of these kind of, sometimes I like the chat, at most times I find it the most toxic use of air bandwidth that is destroying the environment. I struggle from conversation to conversation.
Unlike this Sunday special.
Sunday special, doesn't it? But there was a teacher that was on, and she's been working as a teacher since like 1999, and she was looking back at her pay slips, and she said from 1999 to today, bear in mind I've been promoted a couple of times now, head of this year or form group leader or whatever it is, my pay has only gone up £500 a month, I think, or 400 and something pounds a month in that period of time, in almost 25 years time. 24 years time, which is it's quite a stretch. So in that time the workload has almost quadrupled, because as things have progressed, you're not just teaching like in a 9 to 3 o'clock thing. You have a lot of the student, you've got to do all these student care modules. You've got to do all of this paperwork around how students are performing. You've got to enter things into like these databases, and everything is measured and calculated. So she spends most of her time doing that, and that's before you get to marking, which she saves for the weekends. So if that one isolated person is to be taken into consideration, and obviously the educational spectrum is different depending on whether you are doing early years, because it's obviously far less, to whether you're doing high school GCSE level, that's obviously going to be far more intensive, and if you're obviously going up to university level. It's strange. I think if you are going into being an educator and you're preparing the next generation, I think you probably should be remunerated to a degree. I don't think they have the best working conditions. I think that the holidays that they have are probably a little too egregious, and that's on the side for the student as well. You know,
what's that word?
Unnecessary. Sorry, it's grossly unnecessary, like the length of time. But then you get some teachers that say, actually, if we didn't have that time, we'd burn out. We'd completely burn out with the hours that we're working. Adam's not that one. I saw the nose switch.
The OECD figures are the OECD figures. That's all I'm going to say. They're not.
Yeah.
It's not a political organisation with a point to make. It's measured them. It is what it is, and I don't. It's not just counted up the paid hours. It's counted up the hours that are being.
Oh, so that was my question. I'm like, is that official? Yeah, is that official hours? Because my mum was a teacher, and I know, like, when she was at home in school holidays, she wasn't playing with me. Let me tell you, she was like sat marking, and I was farmed out to like whoever, normally on some course to go and learn something else. But yeah, there's a lot of kind of non-present in school hours. So that's interesting that's accounted for as well.
It's interesting. I mean, you go back to the 75 minutes a day is the average saving from the home workers, they're saying, and some of that is being split into extra work time for people. I mean, every job I think has those extra bits and bobs to associated to an extent. I mean, one of my best friend's wives is a head teacher, and she definitely does over 2,000 hours a year. She is phenomenally. She probably does over 2,500. I mean, her workload, and some of that is obviously through choice. And whether it's a good, I mean, obviously we can't take one person's account because it's anecdotal. I know what you mean about LBC. It's a magnificent bellwether of how the country is feeling, and I think that's what I like about it. Although sometimes I have to turn it off. It's just like Alexa off. It just has to go. But I see what you mean. But there'll also be, like there are in any industry, time wasters and people padding out their days. I'd also be interested whether that extra 500 quid is net of tax these days, because one thing from 99 to 2023 is the tax burden will have gone.
Yeah, I think she actually mentioned that obviously the gross pay had gone up, but she said the netted amount that she's taking away is so marginal from what it was in 2003. I think she was to where it is today. So there was a marginal increase, not in line with standard inflation, not in line with everything else. But it was she seemed quite even keeled. Like she was like during lockdown she thought she'd go back and she'd dig out some of these pay slips, and she kind of shocked herself with what she found.
I kind of feel for the sector as a whole. Driving towards the academy model has obviously tried to bring more business into education, and as budgets balloon every year, I can imagine myself on the Tory side of the table saying, well, we need to measure this stuff, right? We don't need to give them more money. All we do is give them more money. Where are the results? And then on the other side of the fence, I can imagine and see the underfunding argument, which is on the flip side. And really, it becomes more about, and obviously you can apply this to the NHS, you can apply this to whatever. But what I didn't like was hearing the union bosses make the argument that this isn't about money. This is about fairness, and it's for the kids. and they're moaning that the wage rises come out of a school's budget. Well, I'm sorry, mate, but I don't know an organisation that doesn't take its staff's wages out of its budget if you want it to be running remotely as efficiently as a business. And that's where, and I feel for the teachers, because the union bosses are mugging them off, because they're going out and repeating this argument, and that argument is utter fallacy. I mean, look, they want more money.
Emotion, right?
You want more money
for the kids. Yeah, and that's a disgusting misuse of a rhetoric, right? The school budget, I've heard this said in like several different ways, but it depends on how much Kool-Aid the teachers that you talk to are drinking, right? Because some of them are going to be saying, oh, well, there is definitely budget for us to be paid a little bit more. And then there are others saying, well, look, if we get paid more, then there are less resources for the kids. So it's kind of like you're kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul. That's kind of been thrown out there a couple of times. But I also look at it on a school by school basis to find out, because this is where it gets ridiculous. You look at this on a local authority level, right? Because obviously central government funding, local authority government funding, then it kind of filters out through public services. But if you have a look, some of them are grossly overfunded, and then some of them run it to the wire. Well, because they don't want to be underfunded the next year. They want to make sure that the government can see that this is the amount that they need. Actually, no, they need more. So it becomes a game of how can I get the chips from here to here?
And that is why we do have to measure things appropriately. But I know from the last time we looked at, I mentioned my friend whose wife is a head teacher. When we looked at, she asked us to look over a couple of building quotes. This is years and years ago. And I can tell you that the outcome was we wanted to start a construction firm supplying schools, because they have that same problem that the NHS have, where as soon as anyone mentions that, the price is at least doubled. And I'm talking doubled from standard commercial work terms, not from residential. So you're talking trebled or quadrupled. I mean, you really, really are. And it is, once people are at the teat of the public sector, there's a massive problem. And the trouble is, that reinforces the argument to cut budgets. But really, it's a governmental problem. Why doesn't, let's pick on Nadhim Zahawi completely randomly, why doesn't a great entrepreneur, because, we're in a place now where rich people can't really be in government, despite the fact we've got, or we did have, the richest three people as the PM, the Chancellor, and the Conservative Party chairman, than far richer than we've ever had before, realistically. So they can't do that job. But why don't they become social entrepreneurs who have a transparent business that says, okay, well, we'll supply the NHS, we'll do this, we'll do that, we'll have a stated margin, we'll do it that way. There's so much fat to be cut out. But people, unfortunately, the profit maximising motive, everybody who gets into this game supplying the public sector just skins. It's the victimless crime of take it from the government. And someone should do, Elon Musk should do something about that, or someone should do something about it, rather than just try and make as much money as possible from the black hole that is the tax take, Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's a victimless crime until you start actually looking at the second, third order of impacts, right? Yeah. First order impact is that if everyone's doing that, they're going to have to take the lesser of the two or three evils of whichever more reasonable of the most unreasonable quotes they're getting are. But then that affects the budget, that affects resources, it affects wages, it affects all of these different things. And then people are like, oh, well, I can't believe my school isn't doing this, that, and the other. Well, you're the guy that charged 2.5 times the rate. Where do you think this comes from? Like, it's not printed ad infinitum. Do you know what I mean? So,
but I will say, my friend whose wife's a head teacher, she keeps within her budget, and it's tough, but it's doable. So I dare say she's the example of someone who's doing it correctly, and it can be done. But then on the flip side, again, I was delighted to hear a few years ago that the LEA enrolled her in an MBA. And obviously, I'm a great supporter of these illustrious degrees, but genuinely, what a good qualification to give someone, because they're running a business. Yeah. They're running a business with a budget, with all of these constraints, and it's not like running a business like you and I would, where we've got it's a micro business. We've got a member of staff that isn't performing. they might get away with it for a few months, but they're not going to get away with it forever, and they're going to see the door. It's not like that. It's unionized, as discussed. You know, it's got very, very high levels of protection. Even in the States, you hear them talk very much about how powerful the teachers' unions are. And, you know, the California teachers, I can't remember, Caltech, I think it's called. It's one of the biggest investment funds in the world.
It really is.
So it's not. We do have to put into context this debate. Whilst the unions are trying to take it away from pay in the pocket now, how surely there should be an algorithmic representation of job security, pay, pension, holiday, and all the rest of it. And actually, I think you'd find certainly compared to working in retail at minimum wage, but compared to working a whole number of other jobs, it's not that bad a deal when it boils down to it. And if we, like in anything, if we just focus on that one thing in terms of pay at end of month, then it's not so great. But in reality, what we've seen in the first sort of 12 months really of the cost of living crisis, and I'd expand this to energy as well, is that ultimately people can survive on a bit less. Because in the Western world, we do have a lot of excess, and ultimately we can trim certain things down, and it hasn't been the disaster that the Daily Express or whoever would have us believe.
Well, one of the interesting things you find is, you know, and expanding out from teachers to nurses, we could really get done here. The expanding out is you find that the majority of people that are in these roles are doing it because they're passionate about it. For the most part, it isn't about the ones and zeros. I mean, it isn't necessarily. It's nice that they're earning, and they should be earning a decent wage, and they should be able to do more than just eke and survive through life, as should everybody, right? But the majority of people that are teaching is because they're passionate about teaching. They want to improve the lives of children. They want to improve society in terms of the quality of minds that are kind of coming up through the ranks. People that are going into nursing genuinely care about people. And we could go into a whole Jordan Petersonian thing from here about choice and this, that, and the other. But that's the reality. And there hasn't really been any of these strikes. Well, there's been tube and travel strikes pretty much for the last 20 years, as far as I can remember it, on a semi-regular basis. They're always complaining that their £50,000 a year isn't enough for, you know, falling asleep at the wheel, right? That I will get in trouble for. But for the teachers and nurses,
it's more like 65, I think, these days.
Basic. But for the teachers and nurses, I've got a great deal of sympathy, and B, a great deal of respect. You know, that they were at the absolute spear point of everything through COVID and, you know, all that kind of stuff. And realistically, these aren't people that generally complain. They're complaining now because everything in the media is telling them that they can't afford to live on what they have, that there is a crisis in terms of affordability of everything, in terms of cost of living and all of these different things. Whilst there is in certain metrics out and about the place, that's what's really causing it. It's the sentiment that is driving it. It is food producers and people like that are upping prices, and resellers are upping prices, that are actually making life really very difficult. Because 4 years ago, on the same wages at the same time, this wasn't an issue. By and large, it wasn't an issue.
And also, like, without the unions, I don't see teachers or nurses fighting for their own rights. They just, like, they don't do that on a daily basis. That's not what they are made to do in the jobs or train. Like, if a teacher is entrepreneurial and finds for their own rights, they'll probably go and do their own private work and make 3 times the amount of money, and they wouldn't care about the schooling system, right? So it's almost like if you have teachers that are too entrepreneurial, they would go off and they would do the things that maximize the profits. And if you have the teachers that are not that, then they need something to fight for their rights and stuff.
I see what you're saying, but you go back to Jay's point about Peterson. You know, people's personality types are largely entrenched, and they very rarely change. You know, we move in circles within our industry where you do meet people who've had epiphanies, maybe by reading Rich Dad Poor Dad, maybe by going to see Tony Robbins, maybe by all of that stuff. And there's a very fine line between the bullshit side of that and the genuinely empowering side of that does exist. And it takes a certain mindset to see both sides of that fence and make decisions that benefit ourselves. And the reality is that's not for much as, I won't say any names because they're specifically litigious these days, but some of the property education gurus would have you believe it isn't for everybody doing this stuff. And I really dislike when I see people share that being an entrepreneur is doing something that people won't do for a few years so you can live the rest of your life the way they won't. Utter hogwash. That's absolutely not what it is. You will not succeed if you have that mentality where you think, I'm going to work hard, in 3 years' time I'll be on the beach. It's absolute nonsense. And if you look at the mindset of people in Dragon's Den or Shark Tank or whatever, what do? Even though they may not look like they do any work these days, all they do is work, realistically. But they've built the thing around them that they love. Richest men in the world, including Buffett, ultimately what's he doing? He's overseeing his investments. It just so happens that he bloody loves doing that, so he's fine. So I think there'll always be that personality differential. And if you think about the sort of economic implications of what you're saying, Piotr, if you look at places like Sweden, for example, when it comes to healthcare, what they tend to do is it's publicly funded and it's privately provided. Now that gets everybody up in arms, going, don't privatise the NHS. And actually in Sweden, they have a very similar attitude towards that. But people, that whole saying is a complete misnomer. There will never be an IPO for the NHS, right? Yeah. It's not being privatised like that. The logic is, on a £100 million budget, if you let a private company provide it, they can do it for 80 million and still make 20 million profit. And that's the problem with publicly funded services versus privately funded services. If you are aware of Thomas Sowell, the absolutely magnificent American economist, philosopher, thought leader, historian, lots and lots of other things, he talks a lot about when he used to work for the US Department for Labor, and he came up with some pretty decent ideas about how certain budgets could be cut. And he was in his early 20s. Now, the man's an utter genius, a real titan of education and philosophy. And basically, they got torpedoed because what it was turkeys voting for Christmas and people saying, actually, you could cut our budget in this department by 40%. It got to the managerial level and it got whipped out straight away. And that's the problem. They're not incentivized to deliver. And this is where that measurement debate comes back into things. You do have to run these organizations more like businesses, much as that leaves a bad taste in the mouth. But don't think that every business only exists to maximize profits. Every publicly listed company does. But this is why we have community interest companies. This is why we have, and you can point to the John Lewises and stuff of the world, they want to maximize their profits, but where is it going? It's going to the family of the people. There are organizations that have followed this model. So the public sector really does need to follow that model of, and I don't mean it only goes out to tender to Serco and this and that and the other. You need to make these things accessible for people. Academies, if you look at the money that some of the staff are getting paid in academies, people are moaning because some of the head teachers are on 150,000 or even 250,000 a year to manage a few schools. But the point is they're delivering better results on paper when you see it with the same budgets, and they're managing to find more money for wages. What does that tell you? It tells you there's a massive inefficiencies within the public sector driven model. And then what that also tells you is if I'm the government and I'm reading that XYZ's getting 250 grand a year, I'm going to be sharpening the pencil on the budget going forward, because if they can do it, other people can do it, and they don't need to be paid 250 grand for doing it. So that's where the future lies: healthcare, education, everywhere. And this is why you do need to measure it. And I'm absolutely sure that the things they'll be measuring will be rubbish a lot of the time. Absolutely. And that needs work. And you need to get in the. I watched a fascinating thing once about the NHS, and they brought in a world-class operations consultant to tell them what they were doing wrong in a hospital, right? And this guy's internationally respected. And the point of the documentary really was the consultants just wouldn't have it off him, right? Yeah. And he was making all these points. And they were basically spending their time telling him why he was wrong, even though it's their job to be medically untouchably brilliant and people that we all need at certain points in our lives and are very grateful for. But really, when it comes to the operation of the hospital, the fact that every bugger wants to be off on Friday afternoon playing golf and you've got an empty operating theatre is not where things need to be. It's not acceptable. And in a private company, again, you wouldn't have it. You wouldn't have that. You wouldn't be allowed to. So that's where the sort of the sword falls on the public funding, private provision side of the argument, and you could get another 20% performance out of it, and could really build a genuinely long-lasting, very, very, rather than living on our reputation of the past 100, 200 years, build something sustainable that's going to see the UK at the front of the world for the next 100, 200 years.
Yeah.
You're right. About
go on, Helen.
You're right about like we talked about it a lot before, like incentives, like you're saying, if you can see somebody that's getting paid that much, like, okay, what are they doing that we're not? Let's go, like, that's something to aim at. But that doesn't seem to be happening, or it's not happening widespread. Whereas what you are seeing and what all this is about and the strike action, everything, is actually you have demotivated people. So how do you get them from this spiral of being demotivated to, kind of almost a John Lewis, what is there that can incentivize them? How can they participate in the reward of getting to the people that are, running it efficiently and are having the impact? Because the slide is going that way, but there are these, and they are treated kind of as superstars, aren't they? Which is why I guess they demand the money that they do. But how do you get, like sending somebody on an MBA, that's a great step, isn't it? But like, how do you upskill? What else could you give people?
You need a hierarchy of personal development and improvement, and you need those people to be mentors, and you need to embrace the fact that ultimately, if schools are run in a more business-like fashion, and it's not about maximizing profit and maximizing payouts to employees, right? But it's about maximizing outcomes for children, and that's how we measure them. And then if those outcomes were then bonused, talking about that incentive structure reorganization, and what you'll find, like you do, is you'll find people to pick on an arbitrary age who are 55 or whatever that have had an illustrious career, who will then want to become mentors. And I've met many people like that in my life who have become, they've run 7, 8, 9-figure businesses and have become business coaches and mentors. They're harder to find in the property sector, let's just say, because some people just pretend to be that when they're not. But they're out there in all industries, and they're good people doing the right thing for good reasons, who are fairly remunerated for their time. But what they really, you realise, Dalio is probably the best example of this, I think, in the world. The man genuinely wants to try and impart what he's learned to tens of millions of people and anyone who will listen. And the reality of the world we live in is Dalio's got, 1 million followers on whatever, and Kim Kardashian's got, 15 million or 100 million or whatever it is. So don't blame Dalio when the message doesn't get through to everyone, because everyone's making their own choices in that department, Yeah.
So where do you guys stand? I'm a big fan of checks and balances, especially with the last couple of governments and potentially for the next couple as well. Historically, and certainly not in the recent years, I think you have to go back maybe 40 years. Yeah, early 80s, and even then that's a bit of a rough story. Where these kind of where these checks and balances are in place, because you have these interests that are being supported. I've forgotten the exact word now. That's terrible.
Lobbying.
Not even just lobbying, but the people that are in charge of these organisations, these trade organisations. No, it's completely gone out of me.
Quango.
Yeah, just the union. You're talking about the union bosses? No, you're talking about
the union bosses. Yeah, because I think unions have a value. Thank God, unions. How stupid was that? I had onions in my head, and I was like, why am I thinking about onions? Unions.
You need to sort your breakfast requirement out, mate. That's the problem.
I promise.
You get all the difficult words right. But
yes, he can do egregious and he can do esoteric, but he can't do
onion. Union was just so far beneath mine. No. But I mean, there is a place for it, and I think there is a need for it. I think there are so many checks and balances that through legislation are being removed on quite a scary and regular basis at the moment. Even like the right to what was the most recent one? The right to peaceful protest has been restricted by legislation and by this government. So people now don't have that freedom available to say, we don't agree with you, and we're going to stand up peacefully and make that known until this is changed. It's the will of the people.
The human rights infringements over the past 3-4 years in this administration have been some of the worst in history. They'll go down in history as a real row backward. I totally agree. People have got to be able to collectively bargain. You know, I can tell you from my own perspective, right? I don't want to run organisations where people can't afford to live, right, and work for me and can't afford to live. If you go back to what's really interesting, Jay, is I've been thinking about this since you mentioned that teacher's pay slip, right? When I got my first mortgage, totally green, right? A house we negotiated over the bar. I was on the working side of it, to be clear. And the vendor was drinking, which is obviously an ideal time to do a deal. And he was a mortgage broker, right? And he sold us the house, myself and my brother. I was 23. My brother was 18. I was employed at £4.10 or something like that an hour at the time, which I believe was the minimum wage. So we would have been talking 21 years ago, right? And my brother was on £3.63, and it was a glass collector because he was younger. So there was the step in minimum wage that there is now. Now, if I look to today, April the 1st, 2023, let's say, I would be on £10.43 an hour. So I would have had 150% pay rise in 20 years, thanks to the minimum wage sort of dragging things upwards, which would be, I would think, dramatically different from the teacher example. Although, having said that, to mention £500 as an arbitrary figure isn't necessarily the same as saying it as a percentage. But I think what she's saying is pay would only have gone up 33% or something like that. And if that's the case, that teachers have gone up 33% and minimum wage has gone up 150%, don't be surprised when people don't want to be teachers anymore, apart from anything else. I think those numbers would need verifying. But generally speaking, I try to be fair to people. Inflation isn't my business's fault, but also I want to look after staff. Sometimes if we get right into it with someone and we have a bit of a ding dong, I'm also very happy to look at other things in their personal financial situation and see where I can help and give advice. Most people don't want to open the books on that sort of thing, but there's two ways to look at that. I've got one staff member who came to see me one night, and basically we did her estate planning, succession planning. I think the advice I gave her is probably worth about 250 grand. And this is an employee, not a business owner, a really, really significant amount of money. I've advised people on pensions that have quite literally saved them millions of pounds, and not that they're multi-millionaires, but it's made them and their generations beyond them. Well, now, of course, I'm a bit weird, and I'm not looking to maximise all the profits in my own business. I'm looking to look after the people so that they look after me, and then the money follows. That's very much my philosophy on the whole thing. And you can't trust everybody to act like that. You do need collective bargaining. But the problem is, what's the incentive of the people who are doing the collective bargaining to stay in a nice warm office earning £187,000 a year and come up with sound bites just by their existence and their gigantic salary? So paid twice as much as an MP, and it's not their blood on the street when there are issues. So I struggle. There's an internal conflict within me that I can't resolve there, to be honest with you, my friend.
You'd be better with somebody in a position like that that's doing it for the same reasons as the teachers and the NHS that we've talked about. Like, they're doing it because they're genuinely passionate about their members' pay, their members' rights, their, fairness. Why do they need 180 grand to represent all these people that they so-called care about?
Totally agree.
I mean, the thing I think you find with people that find themselves in those positions is that they are, excellent spin doctors, as Adam had mentioned fairly early on in the chat, right? They're able to take a situation, spin the perspective, and, whether it's through emotional blackmail or misuse of numbers, they're able to kind of capture an audience. It's the same way in which you find other people in these kind of situations where, you look at climate control people. These people have good arguments for the most part, but what they do is they end up throwing paint over priceless artwork, and no one wants to listen to them, right? But these are the people that people put front and center because they are the most impassioned, they're the loudest, they're the most dogged. You're not going to find the head teacher that retired 15 years ago running that union, because most of the time some people are just going to roll over them. They could be the best intentioned, the best with knowledge, all that kind of stuff, but unless you're the kind of asshole that's going to stand at the picket lines and calling people turncoats and traitors and throwing rotten fruit and vegetables, as they used to do donkeys years ago at people,
scabs,
scabs and all that kind of stuff, that's why they have these people at these levels. And it's a statement of fact that there's a good chance that and it's the argument that Adam put forward, Ray Dalio's got 1 million followers, Kim Kardashian's got 150 million. No wonder the message is lost. And it's the same thing. These arseholes at the very top, they have that Kim Kardashian audience, right? Obviously not the looks, I'm guessing, but there will be someone on that in that union roundtable that is the Dalio version, is the Dalio person that actually has the right of things and is probably principled and is trying to bring about change that's going to make a difference, which will be completely landslided by this absolute horror of a facade of a human being that they stick in front and full center. And you find that in politics. You find it everywhere where there's authority, power, position. These union bosses, they do wave a really big stick. And when a whole chunk of them over in December got together and decided, let's do this all at the same time because no one's listening. Well, people listened. No one reacted in the way that they wanted them to, but people listened. And following off the back of that, legislation has come out preventing, lawful, peaceful protest. The government is not responding in the way that it should, because everyone's trying to protect a position of power and authority, rather than acting in the best interests of the people and the country, and are standing on an international and global level. I used to take the mickey out of some of these foreign political meetings. I remember once watching one in Turkey, where in the middle of a conversation, they just jumped over and started punching each other. I thought, well, at least we're dignified, right? I mean, you watch it for the fun factor. But you can't say that about our politics. Okay, no one's jumping off of those uncomfortable benches where, let's be honest, they're all falling asleep at the table, apart from the pricks in the front row. But no one's actually paying attention, right? Whereas you go to some of these other countries, even the slightest thing is wrong, that's it. It's carnage for the next. I need to sit in on what Brazil does, because I do love how dramatic Brazilians are. Me and Piotr have a joke. We've engaged with quite a few Brazilians, and they'll go off on a tangent as quick as anything, especially you and I, Adam. It's hilarious.
I think your engagement with Brazilians can wait for another time, but it sounds like fun. So
I'll make sure you're invited next time round. these are just like realities. This is the situation, and it's difficult to argue for any substantive change because you're not going to listen unless people are loud enough or shouting enough or have enough movement. And by the time it gets to that point, it's too late because you have these shysters that infiltrate to actually add like a catalytic converter, get these movements and these positions, these rightful arguments from here to here in public perception. And by the time that happens and the tactics they use, they lose as much influence of their argument and as much righteousness in their argument that no one cares.
Powerful.
Unions, in my view, are certainly necessary. If you could have the Dalio in the group front and center rather than the Kardashian, I think that would bring about a fair bit of change. But I think we're pissing in the wind on that one, in the same way that we're hopeful that this government aren't going to go completely dystopian and remove our right to talk as friends in a live platform on social media, which I think you would struggle.
That would be Mark Zuckerberg.
Well,
makes that decision.
I was going in the opposite direction. I was thinking, good luck trying to do something like this in China or Korea or other countries like that. I mean, you know, at least in America, they have podcasts and they'll be able to do things like this. So as much as Zuckerberg is a bit of a puppet of a human being, at least he enables these things to take place as targeted and as manipulated as they are. There are some countries where this isn't even available.
And that's the end of our Facebook Live career, but there we go.
It was nice chatting with you guys. I'll remember forever.
Remember to question everything and embrace only the changes you want to see in the world and the people around you.
I think we should leave it there. That is the mic drop.
That's the end of the chat for today, guys. Have an amazing Sunday. If we ever speak again.
Thanks, everyone. If we ever speak.